The other major trend that I want to talk about, and once again, let's circle back to the no-till. I want to point out that OEC is very favorable to no-till. We want to make sure that that stays, but we need to learn better practices on how to manage the nutrients associated with no-till, make sure they go into the soil where they belong rather than on the surface. The other major trend is the evolution of confined animal feeding facilities, and that's the main gist of our presentation today. Confined animal feeding facilities are small locations, relatively confined locations, where large numbers of animals are confined in a small area, fed intensively over a period of time, a large majority of their life, and to maximize the output of milk, eggs, or body flesh on those animals. And in terms of hog or dairy cattle production, very often these confined animal feeding operations will store their manure as liquid effluent. And as we discussed before on the major rainfall events, liquids are very, very difficult to control once you get them out there in the countryside. Fluids always want to run downhill. Downhill from any field is a ditch or a stream or a lake or a river along the edge. And that's the problematic aspect of liquid manures in any scenario. Now, a lot of very large livestock operations, poultry operations especially, handle their manure as a dry manure. And, but this is still problematic because any concentration of manure in a relatively small area becomes problematic. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of investment, a lot of equipment, a lot of training to make sure the manure gets from the centralized facility out to where it belongs in the countryside in a responsible manner. And as businesses have grown, as agribusiness have grown, we have developed some very large facilities. And these very large facilities have some extremely large accumulations of livestock waste. And since that manager of the livestock facility is not interested in devoting a whole lot of management time or energy to something that doesn't directly put money in his pocket, a sort of an evolution or a trend has occurred there called the third-party brokering system. And that means another person in the community that may have an interest and want to start a business of his own may buy some equipment and agree to contract his services to this livestock producer to move the manure from that place, from point A to point B, in a responsible manner. To their credit, the Department of Agriculture has acknowledged that this trend existed, and they set up a program called the CLM program, Certified Livestock Manager Program, where they bring in these three third-party brokers. They actually train them to test manure to find out its nutrient content, to test soils to do nutrient content, and train them about the laws of the state of Ohio and the equipment techniques so that they can do a good job. Unfortunately, right now, the laws and administrative codes in the state of Ohio rely upon the good behavior of those certified livestock managers to make sure things are done. There really is very little leverage that the state of Ohio has to enforce good behavior. And we think that that is a major problem. So trust but verify was a phrase used by Ronald Reagan very effectively, and I think it's true in this case too. And we are asking the same thing. We are asking you to visit your representatives today and call on the Ohio Department of Agriculture to make sure that we include the certified livestock managers in that chain of accountability between the operation that actually produces the manure and the inline recipient of that manure. We believe that ODA must impose a schedule of civil penalties that would be available if a CLM were to violate the laws of the state of Ohio by misapplying manure. Right now, there is the only thing that can be done to a CLM is to revoke their certification temporarily, and frankly, that's pretty weak tea in terms of an enforcement technology for a business like this can have a profound effect on the environment. So that's our primary ask today. In terms of some long-term strategies we'd like you to also discuss with your representative, we believe that the Ohio permits large cageloads. That's any confined animal feeding operation over 1,000 animal units. So what has happened since the ones under 1,000 animal units are not permitted at this point, there's really very little regulation for those operations. And because that is the case, we've seen a great growth in the number of facilities just under that threshold. So So fortunately, the Soil and Water Conservation District and the Department of Natural Resources has created this nutrient workbook. It is a relatively farmer-friendly tool that individual farmers, regardless of their size, can use, have at their disposal, and it is pretty effective at teaching them how to responsibly manage their manure. What we were asking you for the second ask is to require that even medium-sized calves, small and medium-sized defined animal feeding facilities, be required to do the nutrient workbook in a watershed that is impaired by nutrients. We think this is a very reasonable compromise between the government and regulatory agencies sticking their nose into farmers' business and the responsibility of the government to make sure that we have clean air and water. So we think that this contingency is a very reasonable compromise. The third thing we are asking for you to discuss is an issue called the phosphorus index. The phosphorus index was created a decade or so ago, essentially as a decision-making tool for farmers to decide where to apply nutrients from their farm, basically manure, when their farm really doesn't need nutrients. And so this phosphorus tool is a tool to decide how to do something that doesn't need done in the least harmful way. And what we are urging is that the phosphorus index be eliminated altogether. And that instead of farmers looking for places on their farm where to put manure where it will have the least damage, we would urge farmers to take manure and move it to another farm or another location in their region where it will do good, where it will be beneficial for crops, and where it will not be a liability for the environment. And then the fourth is that we would like to require a study on the impacts of practice commonly conducted in agriculture, and that's confined animal feeding operations, the impact that they may have on human health. Now, I think we have discussed many, many times, you've seen in the press, that because of the intense concentration on these confined animal feeding operations, the close housing, antibiotics and supplementation of antibiotics is very often required in order to maintain the health of these animals. That has created a strain of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that we think are a concern to human health. So we are going to ask that a study be required by the agencies, the EPA, the Department of Health, the Department of Agriculture, to discern and really let us know what the results of these would be. So those are what we have to offer to you today, and we want to refer to OEC's mission statement to support healthy land, air, and water. We think that this initiative is very consistent for that. I thank you very much, and if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to try to deal with those. Sir?
What's these large animal operations are industrial operations? Why aren't they defined at all as industrial operations as stronger regulations?
Yes, sir. That is an excellent question, and it gets at the differentiation between a farm and an industry. And it is clear that the format and the management systems employed in these very large livestock operations are industrial in nature. They don't embrace the breadth of agricultural processes that farmers used to do. And I say that as a farmer. So I absolutely agree with you that that is a major deficiency in the law. Unfortunately, what we have in Ohio and in many other states are so-called right-to-farm laws. And right-to-farm laws is essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card for some very large industrial agribusiness corporations, essentially. But they get to characterize themselves as farms rather than businesses, and therefore they have immunity from the environmental standards that any other business would have to respond to. We know this is the case. We are, I believe, going to be interrupted in our question session right now because we have